Now in this video, we're going to continue looking at timeline effects, but we're also going to introduce you to ConnectFX and how you can take the work you've done in your timeline and convert it into ConnectFX, either as a flowchart or as a 3D composite. So the next shot we're going to rebuild from our short film is one of them with the heads-up display. So here in the timeline, you can see we've got a clip of our main character. I play this back.
Are you feeling okay? I'm great.
Underneath that layer, we have footage of the woman, and she is supposed to be looking up at the heads-up display, similar to what we see over here in the trailer. We're just going to do a back angle shot instead of one like this. The concept is we've got all these different elements that are part of the heads-up display that we want to composite together as one object and have it floating in space in front of her. This is supposedly what she's seeing through the contact lens. So some of these are animations, some of these are stills. So that's what we're going to do in this presentation. We're going to build the heads-up display, have it floating in her scene so that it looks realistic and bring transparency and light it, and we'll use different blending effects. And we also want to create depth of field. So to do that, we need to be in true 3D space. So let's come back over to our timeline, and we're going to go back up to our top layer where we have our gentleman right here, the character Arthur. And I want to first do some color correction. We can see that it's a very dark clip. Also, we'd like to emphasize him, his face, and so on. We want to create the appearance that this is a video clip playing inside this graphic that we have over here. So let's select our clip in the timeline. I'll go back over to our effect ribbon, and I'm going to add a color warper tool. With the color warper tool selected, I'll choose editor to step right into the tool to access all of its parameters. Now the reason why I want to use this tool right now is because it is a selective color correction tool. At the top level, or the master level, I can come in and I can make adjustments and it will affect everything. But now let's say I want to desaturate some of the elements in this picture on the back wall. So I can switch from working on my master to a selective. Now the keying tools are all available to me. I can define and custom pick the part of the picture I want to desaturate further. First, I'll zoom in and pan over. Then I'll choose the Pick Custom button, and I can region select an area that I want to pull my matte from. If we look at the matte now that we're pulling, we can see that his skin tone was also picked up because of the similarities of the area that I sampled to his skin tone. And I don't want that. I don't want to desaturate his face anymore. So what I can do is come into my color cube area and zoom in on this, and you'll see two triangle shapes, or diamond shapes if you will. And I can come in and start to manipulate and adjust these, trying to fine-tune the matte that's being pulled. I also have tolerance and softness options, so if I activate that, I can come in here and a couple quick clicks on his skin and I refine my matte so that is no longer part of it. I don't mind the fact that the wall or the lamp are part of it. If those get a little more desaturated, that's fine. I can also add a slight blur to this if I want to. Now let's go back and look at the result. If I take my saturation value and start to decrease it, you can see we can desaturate the elements that we had masked out by using our tools inside the color warper. Now let's say we want to add a little more saturation or color back to the face. I can switch this to a second selective, and again I choose Pick Custom, and I'll click and drag along his face. Now if we take a look at this matte, we can see we're really pulling in a lot of the different elements. Now we could come in here to our color cube area, and I'm sure with the right amount of adjustments we can isolate just his skin, but just like any powerful program, Smoke offers many ways of achieving the same effect, and you want to use the tool that is most efficient to get the job done as fast as you can. And I love the color warper, but I know for a fact that I can very easily mask out his skin tone and even animate the mask with the tracking tools so that I can do a color correction that will affect only his skin tone. So I'm going to exit out of the color warper and leave it in the timeline, but we'll add another color correction tool after it. Now with the second color correction tool selected, I'll choose Edit, and we'll step into this tool, and you can see we receive an entire different set of color correction tools. So with this color correction tool, I'll take my saturation, I'll just increase it a little bit. Maybe we can make some minor adjustments to the red, the green, or the gamma to fine tune the skin tone to where I want it to be, and so on. Now, If I return back out to the timeline, I've got the two color correction tools working together. But as we said, I want this second color correction tool to only affect his skin, his face, and so on. So here's where I'll go back to my effects ribbon, and I'll add a garbage mask. I'll go right into the garbage mask tools, and now we want to create a mask around his skin tone. So I'll choose the add button, and I'm going to click and drag and draw a mask around the area that I'm concerned with, mainly his skin. I'll come down along his neck, go down along the shirt. I know I'm adding a lot of control points, but I'm not really even worried about that because I know the power that smoke holds when you use its tracking tools. All right, so now I've got my mask created, and I could definitely fine-tune this a little further, but for demonstration purposes, this is going to work. If I scrub through, we can see he's obviously moving, and we want to animate the mask to follow that. Now, to do that by hand would be a very time-consuming process. Well, here's what we can do in Smoke. I'll region select all of my control points and step into the tracker. Now you'll see I got a tracker box for every single control point of that mask. I can lock them all together. I can make adjustment to all the tracker boxes at one time if I needed to. Once I'm ready, I'll just click Analyze, and the tracker will go through 192 frames and animate the mask automatically for me. Think of doing this by hand. How long would this take you? So the track just finished, and you can see that every single tracker has followed along the placement of his face based on the control points of the mask. So let's go back out to the masking tool. If we take a look at the end result, we can add a little offset to this just to soften it if we need to. And then we're going to return back out to the timeline. Now we can see if I select the original color correction, I start to make adjustments to the contrast or anything else, it's still affecting everything inside the clip. That's because the mask is after our color correction. So I'll take my mask, I'll drag and drop it before the color correction tool, and I'll select my color correction tool and tell it to use the mask. Now you can see we have exactly what I wanted. His face is nice and saturated, lots of color, when everything else in the scene is desaturated. But now I want to take this even further. As I said, I want to create a look as if it was a screen, a video playback of some form that we're going to be using as part of our heads-up display. And while the tools that I have on my timeline are very powerful, as you can see, ConnectFX allows you to do so much more because of the vast variety of tools available to you. Just for demonstration purposes, let me step back for a second and select this clip right here. If I wanted to take just this individual clip into ConnectFX, what I could do, select it, and go over to my effects ribbon, and instead of using one of my timeline tools, I just choose Create ConnectFX. Now we step into our node-based compositor. We are still in our timeline. This node right here is the output that goes back to the timeline. In fact, I can go to the timing tab, and you can see I can access all the clips and everything involved in the clip or clips that I bring into ConnectFX. Looking at the tool set, you can see it is quite an elaborate selection of tools, from time warps to stylizing to pull downs to color corrections to keying, glows, garbage masks, utility tools to deal with interlacing, and so on. Let's say I wanted to create a very stylized effect. We have a tool called Stylize. If I take that tool and I drag and drop it into the flow, you'll see it gets connected. So my footage now goes into my ConnectFX node, the Stylize tool, and then it goes back out to the timeline. Understanding the colors of the nodes is an important part of the workflow in ConnectFX. So really quickly, let me just explain that anytime you see a yellow output, that is the result of the current node. If there is a blue input or output, that is the matte, whether it's the output of the matte or the input of the matte, depending upon the tool. If you see a green input, that means there's a compositing element available in that tool, and that is your back input. And the red input is your front or your RGB. So that's why the yellow output of this node went into the red of this node, then the yellow of the stylized node went into the red of our CFX node back to the timeline. If I double click on a tool, it'll bring up all the parameters relevant to that individual tool. And depending upon what tool you select, you'll see the different parameters are exposed in the bottom of the UI. Many tools have presets, and if I expand the flyout, you can see that this Stylize tool comes with quite a few presets. I can change whatever preset I want to use, and then the end result of this tool will obviously be different from the other presets. And then you can go and customize and change any parameter or build your own set of tools and presets and save them. All right, so that's a quick introduction to ConnectFX. I don't really want that Stylize tool. I'll get rid of it. Let's go back out. So as you saw, I added a ConnectFX to an individual clip. If I select this clip over here, the one of Arthur, where we have multiple tools already applied to it, watch what happens when I go into ConnectFX. But I'm going to first enable the option that reads Selection as Flow Graph. Then I choose Create ConnectFX. And we step into ConnectFX. There's my footage that I had selected, but there's the color warper that I applied. There's the color correction tool I applied. There's the garbage mask I created and tracked. All of it is converted over into a ConnectFX tool. So now I can take what I did out of the timeline and continue to add and build on it with more tools down here inside of the ConnectFX tool bin. For example, I can take a tool named Damage and I can drag and drop it into the flow. Now the Damage tool is going to affect the end result of the color corrector. Let me double click on my Damage tool to bring up its parameters, and you can see there's several different options we have as far as creating a damaged look to your footage. We want blotches, maybe you want to add some hairs or do a vignette, and so on. So there's lots of different parameters and controls with the Damage tool. And just like the Stylize tool, which we just looked at, we get a series of presets. So let's say I wanted to do the bad projector. So I choose that. We get a similar end result to what I was just creating, but as you can see with this preset, there's a lot more. Maybe I want to have this look like night vision goggles. So now I've got the night vision goggle preset. And you can customize and change them, and again, save them for your own purposes. Let me click the reset button to undo all that, and I'll switch my damage type to analog. All I really want to do is add some scan lines to this. So I'll enable the scan line option, and I'll take the scale and we'll just adjust it to about 14. Now we've got the end result of what we want to be playing in our heads-up display. So I'm going to exit out of CFX. We're back in our timeline. Now we want to start compositing this with our background clip to make it appear if it's floating with other elements that we have inside of our media source. So now watch this option. I'm going to select the top clip that has a ConnectFX already applied to it. I'll also select my bottom clip. And then when I go back to the effects ribbon, instead of choosing selection as flow graph, I'll choose selection as 3D comp. Now what happens is all the tools that I had before, the ones that I created, my color warper tool, the damage tool, the color correction tool, the garbage mask, all of it is accessible from this group node. If I wanted to, I could right click and ungroup it, and then all the nodes would be exposed in my schematic view. But I'm going to leave it as a grouped object because it's nice and neat, and I can still access each individual tool if I needed to. We're going to leave it so the last thing coming out of it is the damage. And then what Smoke did is add some utility nodes to the original background footage and took both of them into the Action 3D Compositor as individual layers. I'm going to also feed the backplate into the background input for Action because I want to use it as a tracking reference in just a minute. I want to step deeper into this Action tool. It's the same Action tool we had in our timeline when we looked at how we can composite those contact lenses on the woman's eyes. But inside ConnectFX, the Action tool allows you to composite an unlimited number of layers. I'm going to use a hotkey to step into the schematic view for the Action. Remember, this is the ConnectFX schematic right here. It's a flow chart, and this is my timeline. So all these different elements and tools are always going to go right back to the timeline. The Action tool itself has a schematic view to easily access the elements in your 3D composite. So I'm going to hit a hotkey, and now we're in the Action schematic view. Just as the Action tool that we saw in our timeline, the one in ConnectFX always has a default camera, and we can do the same thing. We can animate and manipulate the camera if we had to. And each image source came in with an axis that will allow me to manipulate and transform and so on. The first thing I'll do is go to my action bin. I want to take another axis out because I want to create a tracking data that I can then use as the master controller for all the elements I'm about to import and composite together. So with this axis selected, I choose to go into the tracker. I'll zoom back a little bit. I'll take the tracker box, position it right over here by this light, and just choose Analyze. And Smoke's going to go through 192 frames in less than 15 seconds and create the track data for me. Now, the reasoning behind doing it on an individual axis like that is I can then feed that axis and have it control as many layers as I want by building a parent-to-child relationship. So when I step back out to the action environment, I'll rename this axis so I know this is the track. Now let's bring in another element that we're going to use as part of our heads-up display. So I'll just click and drag and drop this element, which is the video chat for Arthur. First thing I'll do with the image selected, I'm going to change its blend mode to be a screen. I can also take the transparency and dial it down a little bit. Then I'm going to take the track axis and I'm going to connect it to both of those axes that are controlling these images. This now gives me a master control over both of them. But before I manipulate that, let's take the axis for our footage of the gentleman, Arthur. Let's scale it down and move it into position where we want it to be. Now, if I want to, I can start to manipulate the master, the tracked axis, rotation, its scale, and so on. You can even take it further. If I go back and take another axis, I can connect that as this is the master of everything. Then I have full control of the position, rotation, and scale on an individual level without affecting the track data that's on that axis. So let's just rotate this. We'll scale it down, position it on the Y. So this was the concept as how this was going to be done. You can see as we scrub through, the heads-up display is floating, and I can also take individual layers in Z space if I wanted to create the depth that I'm going to want for a heads-up display. Now, as I said, there's several different elements we want to use. Instead of doing this live in front of you, what I'd like to do is load a preset that I've already created where I have all the different elements composited together. So I'll click on the Load button, which takes me to my saved setups for ConnectFX. I'll select this one, and immediately we'll return back in to ConnectFX, and you can see a little more elaborate than what I was doing a second ago. Let's do this. Let's connect our output to our new composite that I just brought in, and I'll hit the Escape key to step into the action node with the new layers. So now if I zoom back, you can see we've got a lot more objects, a lot more elements already composited in here. And as I select individual elements, individual images, you can see I've changed the blend mode, I've adjusted transparency on some of them, and I've also repositioned them inside a 3D space. For example, if I take this viewport right here and I set this to be what's called a working viewport, I can now orbit and rotate my scene, and you can see what I'm referring to. Individual layers have been scaled down, they've been repositioned and moved around in Z space because I want to create depth of field from this. Let me switch this back to our default camera view, and I'll zoom in on it, and I'll get my select tool once again. So I've got my track just like I did before. There's the axis that has all the tracking data. You can see all the keyframes here. I'll hold down the shift key and just quickly connect all the different elements except for our backplate layer. Also, I'm going to create one more axis like I did before. I'll connect that by holding the shift key. This will be our master. Now I can rotate this like so, scale this down, and position the elements where we want them to be so they're floating in space as they would in her heads-up display. Something kind of like this. Now it's important to understand that the action tool, our 3D compositing tool, can have multiple outputs, and it's not like the action tool is the end. In fact, many times the end result of one action tool is used as a layer in another action tool. So it's kind of like pre-comping, if you will. And if you go to the Output tab for your action tool, you'll see by default you always have one output. But you can add multiple outputs, and you can control what type of output it is. So by default, it's going to be the comp. So everything that is visible in your scene will be part of that. You can also switch the type to be your ambient occlusion. You can do a shadow pass or a matte pass. And you can also output a Z depth pass, just like you would do in a 3D application. So in this shot, They wanted to create depth of field of the different elements floating in 3D space. So you'll see I have a second output here. Well, first of all, I do not want this image of the woman to be part of the output, so I can just hide it very easily. You can also exclude and add different objects through this menu here, but I find it easy just to hide it. Now it will not be part of the output. Now if I switch back to look at our output for the Z depth, you can see this is what's going to be output. And then I can use this output to go into a depth of field tool inside of ConnectFX. So let me take this view here. Let's first of all take a look at our normal output just so we can see it. And let's take this view and go back to our schematic view for ConnectFX. I'll zoom in on the node here. So there is the action node. And remember what I told you, the yellow output is your main output. But there's also a gray output here. That is my Z depth pass. So I'll go down to my tool bin for ConnectFX and I'll find my depth of field tool. I'll bring it in. And what we'll do is connect the main output to the main input, which makes sense. Then we'll take our depth pass and feed that to the Z depth input for the depth of field tool. Now let's change this viewport so we can see this a little better. And I'll double click on our depth of field tool. Down below we have what's called the depthogram. First of all, we'll take our blur amount and just crank this really high. I'll set my blur to about 165, and now we can see in the viewport, everything's pretty much being blurred. That's because we haven't adjusted our depthogram parameters down here. I can grab my focal plane, which is the yellow line, and just start manipulating it, and in the viewport, you're going to see whatever is clearly in focus is what's going to be in focus, and everything else is going to be blurred around it based on its Z depth position coming out of the action tool. I can also adjust my focus range with the blue and the red line. So now I've created the look that I wanted. There are elements that are further away from the camera coming out of the action tool are being blurred automatically because of the depth of field pass and the depth of field tool inside of ConnectFX. Let's now recomposite this end result of our depth of field with the backplate of the woman. Also, I'm just going to hide my media library. I don't need this right now, and I want a little more real estate to look at my schematic and so on. So I'm going to come over here where we have the output of the woman. I'm just going to move it up here so we see it closer to where I want to composite it together. I'll go back to my tool bin. I'll take another action tool. I'll feed the woman's footage in as the background plate. I'll create a new layer with a hotkey, and then I'll connect the main output from the depth of field tool as the main input for this layer. Going into this new action tool, I can double click on that image, which is the end result of the depth of field and the action tool, and switch the blend mode to be screen. Now we are creating the end result we're trying to achieve. Go back out to my schematic view. I'll connect this to the output for our timeline. Because remember, everything that I've done is going back to our timeline. This output node is our timeline. So all this work we've done inside of ConnectFX, all the compositing of different elements, the tracking, the color correction, all these pieces that we've used are accessible to us if we need to change anything, including if we go way back to the beginning, I select this original group node, I can go to any tool that's part of that group, make adjustments to it, and it will ripple through the entire effect going back to the timeline. This is a great example of the power you have inside of ConnectFX. But I'm happy with this. I don't want to change anything. I want to go back to my timeline. So I choose Exit CFX. We go back to our timeline. The end result of that ConnectFX is right here in my timeline, and I can now render this. And more importantly is how easy it is for me to make changes if I need to. If I'm watching my edit and I want to change something with this shot, I don't go to another application. I choose ConnectFX, I choose Enter, I go in here, I make the changes, and I go right back out to my timeline. This is why we are saying Smoke 2015, editing and effects more accessible than ever.